The woman carrying the oldest leather folder in the room was the only person there who could destroy the company with a single signature. Damien Cross did not know that when he laughed at her. "I am glad you are here. Follow my story until the end and tell me where you are watching from, because some humiliations travel farther than private jets." The ballroom of the Blackstone Meridian Hotel in downtown Chicago smelled like polished oak, expensive perfume, and fresh espresso drifting from the executive lounge upstairs. Snow pressed softly against the towering glass windows overlooking the river, while the annual shareholder summit unfolded beneath golden chandeliers that reflected across marble floors like melted candlelight. Every executive in the room wore confidence the way politicians wear tailored suits. Loud, deliberate, measured for attention. I sat behind the smoked glass wall of the private investor suite on the second level, hidden from the crowd below. At 71 years old, I had learned something important about wealth. The loudest people in a company usually own the smallest part of it. Damien stood near the presentation stage, shaking hands with board members and financial reporters, smiling with the kind of sharp charisma that made television anchors trust him instantly. He was 46, handsome in a polished magazine way, and completely addicted to admiration. Beside the registration desk stood Natalie Pierce, my Proxy representative for the evening. She wore a charcoal coat with silver buttons and carried a weathered leather folder tucked beneath one arm. She looked more like a retired librarian than someone walking into a billion-dollar merger vote. That was precisely why I trusted her. Damien noticed her as she approached the executive check-in table. His smile changed immediately. Smaller. Colder. One of the assistants quietly explained that Natalie was carrying voting authorization documents on behalf of a silent investor. Damien glanced at her papers and laughed softly enough for nearby executives to hear. "We are discussing a corporate merger tonight," he said. "Not renewing someone's parking permit." Several people chuckled. Natalie remained still. Her fingers tightened slightly around the folder, but her expression never moved. Damien looked her over once more before adding, "Tell your employer next time to send someone who actually belongs in this room." Then Natalie calmly placed the leather folder onto the registration counter and looked directly at him. "Ms. Mercer," she said quietly, "will remember this meeting. 3 months before the shareholder summit in Chicago, winter rain tapped softly against the tall bay windows of my townhouse, overlooking Commonwealth Avenue in Boston, while the city disappeared beneath gray fog rolling in from the harbor. The house smelled faintly of cedarwood, old paper and black coffee that had been sitting untouched beside my desk for nearly an hour. I spent most mornings alone inside the library on the second floor, where shelves filled with leather financial ledgers stretched from floor to ceiling beneath warm brass reading lamps. The younger generation called firms like mine invisible money, quiet capital, patient ownership. They assumed silence meant weakness because modern executives confuse publicity with power. Damien Cross was one of those men. I first invested in Bellamy Strategic Holdings 11 years earlier after the company nearly collapsed during an infrastructure debt crisis nobody, in the press, ever fully understood. Publicly, the recovery looked like brilliant executive restructuring. In reality, my late husband and I stabilized the business through layered private trusts, routed across 3 family holding companies designed specifically to avoid media attention. We never wanted headlines. We wanted permanence. That morning, Natalie Pierce sat across from me at the long walnut conference table, reviewing governance summaries while soft jazz drifted quietly from the radio near the fireplace. Snowmelt slid slowly down the windows overlooking the narrow Boston street below, where delivery trucks crawled through slush beside rows of brownstone homes. Natalie adjusted her glasses and placed another compliance report beside my coffee cup. "The merger projections are inflated," she said calmly, "especially the projected expansion numbers tied to the Western acquisition." I studied the figures beneath the warm lamplight. Damien had spent the past year transforming himself into the public face of Bellamy Strategic Holdings. Magazine covers, business podcasts, investor conferences in Aspen and Miami. Every appearance carefully polished. Every speech loaded with fashionable executive language about disruption and aggressive growth. Yet buried beneath the glamorous branding, debt exposure continued widening. "He wants visibility more than stability," I said quietly. Natalie nodded once. "And people like him eventually mistake applause for protection." Outside, A church bell echoed faintly across the wet Boston streets while headlights reflected along the rain-darkened pavement below. I closed the financial packet slowly and looked toward the portrait of my late husband hanging above the fireplace mantel. He used to warn me that companies rarely collapse because of market conditions alone. Most fail because someone inside becomes addicted to being admired. I had ignored too many warning signs already. Across the table, Natalie gathered the documents neatly back into her weathered leather folder. "The Chicago vote will decide everything," she said softly. I looked toward the falling rain beyond the window and answered with complete certainty. "Then we should finally attend in person." The executive dinner took place on the 42nd floor of the Archer Pinnacle Tower overlooking downtown Chicago, where the river reflected silver beneath freezing November rain, and slow-moving traffic glowing red across the wet streets below. Inside the rooftop steakhouse, soft piano music drifted through the private dining room while servers carried trays of dry-aged ribeye, roasted sea bass, and crystal glasses filled with deep red wine beneath dim amber lighting. Every surface inside the room reflected money without needing to announce it. Black marble walls, brass fixtures polished to mirror brightness, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city skyline like a private painting, reserved for people who believed they owned the future. Damian Cross stood near the center table surrounded by board advisors and acquisition consultants while financial reporters waited near the cocktail lounge hoping to capture comments before the merger vote in 2 days. He moved through conversations effortlessly, touching shoulders, laughing loudly, performing confidence for everyone around him. Natalie Pierce entered quietly several minutes after the dinner began, carrying her familiar leather folder against her charcoal coat. A few younger executives glanced toward her briefly before returning their attention to Damian. None of them recognized the woman who technically represented more voting authority than almost everyone in the room combined. That amused me more than it should have. I remained seated near the far end of the private investor section, partially hidden behind the wine partition wall where the city lights reflected softly across the glass beside me. Damian noticed Natalie approaching the executive registration table and smiled with visible irritation. "You again," he said while swirling bourbon slowly inside his glass. "I thought this dinner was restricted to leadership." Several consultants nearby laughed politely. Natalie remained calm. "I am attending on behalf of Ms. Mercer." Damian leaned slightly closer. "Then your employer should really invest in a better messenger." The comment landed harder than the laughter that followed. I watched Natalie's posture stiffen almost invisibly before she handed her credentials to the event coordinator beside the table. Damian glanced toward one of the younger vice presidents standing nearby. "This is exactly the problem with old money," he said loudly enough for surrounding guests to hear. "People hiding behind assistants and paperwork, while the rest of us actually build things." Across the room, one junior financial analyst lowered his eyes immediately after hearing the remark. 30 minutes later, while dessert plates carrying dark chocolate torte and espresso cream circulated beneath the warm restaurant lights, the same analyst quietly approached my table holding a thin gray compliance folder against his chest. His hands trembled slightly. "Ms. Mercer," he whispered carefully, "I think you should see the acquisition exposure reports before tomorrow morning." I studied his nervous expression for a moment while rain continued sliding across the skyscraper windows overlooking Chicago below. Then I accepted the folder without saying another word. The compliance folder felt heavier than paper should have as I carried it through the nearly empty executive corridor long after the rooftop dinner ended. Midnight rain rattled softly against the windows lining the 42nd floor while cleaning crews moved quietly through the conference center below, their carts rolling across marble tiles polished bright beneath cold fluorescent lighting. Chicago looked distant from that height, reduced to scattered headlights and silver reflections sliding across wet streets near the river. Natalie walked beside me in silence while holding the leather folder Damian Cross had mocked less than an hour earlier. Neither of us spoke until we reached the restricted archive office Bellamy Strategic Holdings, rented for confidential merger reviews during the summit week. The room smelled faintly of printer toner, dust, and stale coffee forgotten beside stacks of acquisition paperwork spread across a long steel conference table. One overhead lamp flickered softly above rows of financial binders and storage boxes labeled with property transfer codes and debt restructuring schedules. Natalie removed her coat carefully before opening the gray compliance packet handed to me by the junior analyst at dinner. Inside were internal projections Damien never intended for shareholders to study closely. Inflated growth assumptions. Deferred liabilities hidden beneath temporary asset transfers. Luxury expansion commitments tied to financing structures balanced almost entirely on projected valuation. Increases that had not happened yet. The deeper we read, the quieter the room became. Snow mixed with rain now tapped steadily against the narrow archive windows overlooking downtown Chicago, while old heating vents hummed softly through the ceiling above us. Natalie adjusted her glasses and turned another page slowly beneath the lamplight. These numbers were never designed to survive long-term scrutiny, she said quietly. I studied the debt schedules in silence. Damien had not technically committed fraud. Men like him rarely crossed lines directly. Instead, they built elegant systems designed to look successful long enough for somebody else to inherit the consequences later. That was more dangerous. Near 2 o'clock in the morning, another figure appeared quietly in the archive doorway carrying additional filing binders against his chest. It was the same young analyst from the dinner. His name was Ethan Caldwell. He looked nervous standing beneath the dim hallway lights. I should not be here, he admitted softly. But the acquisition team has been altering exposure timelines before every board presentation. Natalie exchanged a glance with me before Ethan carefully placed another stack of internal reports onto the conference table. One document immediately caught my attention. Executive bonus acceleration clauses tied directly to merger approval deadlines. Damien stood to earn nearly $24 million if the board approved expansion before the liabilities surfaced publicly. The room fell completely silent except for rain striking the glass outside. I leaned back slowly in the archive chair while studying the numbers spread beneath the cold overhead lighting. Then I finally understood why Damien mocked quiet investors so aggressively. Men obsessed with appearances become terrified of people who still pay attention to facts. The shareholder gala began just after 7 in the evening inside the grand atrium of the Halstead Financial Exchange, where towering marble columns rose beneath vaulted ceilings painted in muted gold and ivory tones that glowed softly beneath enormous crystal chandeliers. Outside, freezing wind swept through downtown Chicago while snow spiraled between black town cars arriving beneath the covered entrance lined with photographers and financial reporters waiting for executive interviews before the merger announcement the following morning. Inside the ballroom, live violin music drifted above hundreds of quiet conversations carried through the scent of champagne, polished cedar, and expensive perfume lingering beneath the warm lighting. Investors, attorneys, acquisition consultants, and board members moved through the room with careful smiles practiced over decades of corporate negotiations. Damien Cross stood near the central staircase greeting media guests, while cameras flashed against the silver backdrop, displaying the Bellamy Strategic Holdings logo in enormous illuminated letters. He looked perfectly constructed for the moment. Tailored tuxedo, confident posture, controlled laughter. The kind of man business magazines describe as visionary because they never study the paperwork closely enough. Natalie Pierce entered through the eastern ballroom corridor carrying her familiar leather folder beneath one arm, while snow melted quietly along the hem of her charcoal coat. Several younger executives noticed her immediately and exchanged subtle smiles behind their champagne glasses. Damien spotted her moments later and visibly sighed before approaching with theatrical patience. "I really admire your dedication," he said loudly enough for surrounding guests to hear. Most assistants would have stayed home by now. A ripple of restrained laughter passed through the nearby executive circle. Natalie calmly removed her gloves without responding. Damien glanced toward the folder beneath her arm again. Still carrying paperwork for someone too important to attend personally? Before Natalie could answer, Conrad Bellamy himself appeared near the staircase landing holding a sealed governance envelope against his chest. His expression looked unusually tense beneath the ballroom lights. Damien immediately shifted attention toward him, sensing something important. Across the ballroom, I remained seated inside the elevated investor mezzanine partially concealed behind smoked glass, overlooking the gala floor below. From there, I watched every conversation without being seen clearly myself. Natalie slowly placed the leather folder onto a marble side table near the ballroom entrance, and looked directly at Damien while violin music echoed softly beneath the chandeliers overhead. "You should be careful mocking people you have never bothered to understand," she said quietly. Damien smirked dismissively. "And you should probably remember whose company this is. At that exact moment, Conrad Bellamy opened the governance envelope beneath the glowing ballroom lights and began reading the documents inside. The color drained slowly from his face. By 8:30, the shareholder gala had transformed into a performance of controlled elegance beneath the towering chandeliers of the grand atrium, while snow continued drifting beyond the massive windows overlooking downtown Chicago. String musicians played softly near the marble staircase as waiters moved through the ballroom carrying silver trays filled with champagne and espresso cups between clusters of investors speaking in low-polished voices about market confidence and acquisition forecasts. Yet beneath the luxury atmosphere, tension had already begun spreading quietly through the executive circle surrounding Conrad Bellamy, near the central donor platform. He continued rereading the governance packet with growing concern while two legal advisors stood beside him whispering urgently beneath the glow of the ballroom lights. Damian Cross noticed immediately. His smile remained fixed for the cameras nearby, but his posture tightened almost invisibly as he crossed the marble floor toward the chairman. "Everything all right?" he asked with controlled confidence. Conrad looked at him for a long moment before answering carefully. "Where exactly did you source the Western acquisition debt guarantees?" Damian blinked once, clearly surprised by the question arriving publicly during the gala itself. Those details were already approved by executive review. One of the attorneys quietly opened another document from the packet. Not by majority preferred shareholders. The surrounding conversations nearby softened almost instantly as several board members sensed the shift in tone. Damian forced a laugh and glanced toward the mezzanine investor level above them. This is hardly the setting for procedural discussions. Then the ballroom changed completely. The private glass doors overlooking the investor mezzanine opened quietly above the main floor, and every executive near the staircase instinctively looked upward. I stepped out onto the balcony wearing a dark navy evening coat beneath the soft chandelier glow, while Natalie Pierce joined me carrying the leather folder Damian had mocked repeatedly throughout the week. Nobody laughed now. Several older board members recognized me immediately. One director nearly dropped his champagne glass onto the marble floor. Conrad Bellamy straightened beside the staircase and lowered his voice respectfully. "Miss Mercer." Damian stared upward in visible confusion before realization finally reached him piece by piece. The silent investor. The proxy authority. The layered trusts. All of it connected at once behind his eyes. Natalie calmly removed several notarized governance documents from the leather folder, while legal counsel descended toward the ballroom floor carrying updated shareholder voting records. Through Mercer Holdings and affiliated trusts, Conrad announced carefully beneath the silent chandeliers. Ms. Evelyn Mercer currently controls 51% of preferred voting authority tied to Bellamy Strategic Holdings. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Damian looked pale beneath the ballroom lights now. "That is impossible," he said quietly. One of the attorneys handed him the verified governance transfer documents. The proxy activation became legally effective at 6:45 this evening. Snow swirled outside the towering windows while the entire ballroom watched. Damian Cross realized the woman he dismissed as irrelevant had already owned the future of the company before he ever walked into the room. The silence inside the grand atrium lasted only a few seconds, but it felt long enough for every executive in the ballroom to reconsider where they were standing and who they had aligned themselves beside during the past year. Snow pressed softly against the towering windows overlooking Chicago while violin music continued somewhere near the staircase, strangely delicate against the weight now settling across the room. Damian Cross remained frozen near the center platform holding the governance documents with one hand, while cameras from financial reporters slowly lowered around him. Nobody wanted to photograph confidence collapsing in real time. Conrad Bellamy stepped away from the donor staircase and quietly addressed the legal advisors gathered beneath the chandeliers. "Prepare the emergency board session for tomorrow morning," he instructed calmly. Several executives immediately began checking their phones while assistants whispered urgently near the marble corridors leading toward the conference wing upstairs. The atmosphere had shifted completely. Only 30 minutes earlier, Damian moved through the ballroom like the future chief executive of Bellamy Strategic Holdings. Now people avoided standing too close to him. I descended from the mezzanine level slowly beside Natalie Pierce while conversations parted ahead of us almost instinctively. The polished marble staircase reflected warm chandelier light beneath our feet as snow swirled outside beyond the massive glass walls surrounding the ballroom. Damien finally looked directly at me for the first time all evening. "You planned this," he said quietly. There was no anger left in his voice now, only disbelief. "No," I answered calmly once we reached the ballroom floor. "I noticed what you became." Several board members nearby lowered their eyes immediately. Damien glanced toward Natalie standing beside me with the leather folder still resting against her arm. The same woman he repeatedly dismissed now carried documents controlling the future of the company he believed he already owned. "You could have introduced yourself from the beginning," he said. I studied him for a moment beneath the soft ballroom lighting. "And you could have treated people with dignity before knowing whether they mattered to you personally." The sentence landed harder than any public accusation could have. Nearby, 2 media consultants quietly collected their materials before leaving through the eastern corridor without saying goodbye to Damien. A senior acquisition advisor followed moments later. One by one, people began distancing themselves from him with the quiet efficiency unique to corporate culture. Nobody wanted proximity to instability. Conrad approached holding another folder tied with navy legal ribbon. "Pending board review," he announced carefully. "All executive bonus accelerations and acquisition authorizations are suspended effective immediately." Damien stared at him in shock. "You are freezing the merger?" Conrad nodded once. The governance committee voted unanimously after reviewing the exposure reports submitted tonight. Across the ballroom, servers continued replacing empty champagne glasses while string musicians played softly beneath the chandeliers, as though elegance itself was attempting to survive the collapse unfolding around it. Damien looked back toward me again, finally understanding the truth too late. He spent years building an image powerful enough to impress strangers, while completely ignoring the quiet people already carrying the structure of the company in their hands. For weeks after the shareholder summit, winter settled heavily across Chicago while headlines about Bellamy Strategic Holdings quietly shifted from merger speculation to governance restructuring and executive accountability reviews. Snow lined the sidewalks outside the restored headquarters building on Wacker Drive, where early morning light reflected silver across the frozen river beneath pale gray skies. Inside the executive tower, the atmosphere felt entirely different from the performative tension that once followed Damien Cross through every conference room and marble corridor. Conversations moved more slowly now. People listened carefully before speaking. Administrative staff no longer rushed nervously whenever senior executives entered elevators or stepped into meetings. Stability had replaced spectacle. I spent most mornings inside the old library conference suite overlooking the river, where sunlight filtered softly through tall windows across shelves filled with decades of acquisition records and handwritten governance ledgers preserved from the company's earliest years. The room smelled faintly of paper, cedarwood, and fresh coffee while quiet jazz played from a small speaker beside the fireplace. Natalie Pierce sat across from me reviewing scholarship proposals submitted by junior employees applying for continuing education grants funded through the newly reorganized Mercer Leadership Initiative. "You realize the staff still talks about the gala almost every day," she said with quiet amusement while organizing the folders neatly across the conference table. I smiled faintly without looking up from the quarterly restructuring reports in front of me. "People enjoy stories about powerful men falling." Natalie shook her head gently. "No. They remember because somebody important finally noticed the people usually ignored." Outside the windows, snow drifted slowly across the riverwalk while employees crossed the plaza below carrying coffee cups and briefcases through the cold morning air. Several floors beneath us, a new employee orientation session had just begun for administrative assistants, junior analysts, and support staff entering the company for the first time. Months earlier, those workers would have remained invisible inside the corporate hierarchy Damien built around image and status. Now they sat at the center of the restructuring priorities. Ethan Caldwell eventually joined us carrying updated compliance summaries beneath one arm. He looked calmer than he had during the summit week. More confident. "The final executive review committee approved the restructuring unanimously this morning," he explained. "Most of the old expansion plans are gone." Natalie glanced toward me quietly. "And Damien?" Ethan hesitated briefly before answering. "No major firm has hired him yet. The room fell silent for a moment except for the soft crackling of the fireplace near the windows. I felt no satisfaction hearing the update. Only clarity. Men like Damien spend years believing influence belongs to whoever speaks the loudest in expensive rooms. They rarely understand that real institutions survive because quiet people continue carrying responsibility long after applause disappears. Downstairs, laughter drifted faintly upward from the employee orientation gathering while snow continued falling beyond the riverfront glass. For the first time in years, Bellamy Strategic Holdings no longer felt like a company performing confidence for cameras. It felt like a company learning how to breathe honestly again. 2 months after the merger collapse, the first snowstorm of January settled quietly across Chicago while warm. Golden light spilled from the restored headquarters of Bellamy Strategic Holdings onto the Riverwalk below. The company hosted its annual winter reception that evening inside the newly renovated Executive Hall, where tall evergreen arrangements lined the marble corridors and soft piano music echoed beneath crystal chandeliers, reflecting against polished glass walls overlooking the frozen Chicago River. The atmosphere no longer carried the restless energy that once followed every corporate gathering during Damien Cross's reign. People spoke more naturally now. Laughter sounded genuine instead of strategic. Assistants and junior analysts moved through the room comfortably beside senior board members, without the invisible tension that used to divide them. I stood near the western windows holding a cup of black coffee while snow drifted slowly beyond the skyline, covering rooftops and quieting the city beneath layers of silver and white. At 71 years old, I had attended more executive receptions than I cared to remember. Yet this was the first one in many years that felt honest. Natalie Pierce joined me beside the windows wearing a dark emerald dress beneath her familiar charcoal coat folded carefully over one arm. For the first time since arriving in Chicago months earlier, she looked entirely at ease inside the building where people once treated her like background furniture. Across the ballroom, Ethan Caldwell laughed with several young analysts near the scholarship presentation display funded through the Mercer Leadership Initiative. Conrad Bellamy stood nearby speaking calmly with department directors, while employees from every level of the company filled the reception hall together, instead of separating themselves into invisible social tiers. Natalie glanced toward the ballroom and smiled softly. "It feels different now," she said. I watched snow gather slowly along the frozen riverwalk below before answering. Strong companies should feel steady, not theatrical. A few minutes later, a young administrative assistant approached nervously holding a tray of coffee cups. She could not have been older than 23. "Miss Mercer," she asked carefully, "may I ask you something?" I nodded once. "Why did nobody know you already owned so much of the company before all this happened?" The question lingered quietly between us while soft piano music drifted through the glowing ballroom behind her. I looked across the river toward the falling snow outside before finally answering. "Because real power does not introduce itself every time it enters a room." The young woman smiled slowly as though she would remember the sentence for the rest of her life. Across the hall, Natalie took her seat beside the board members during the annual recognition ceremony, while employees applauded warmly beneath the chandelier light. Months earlier, she stood in the same building being mocked for carrying a leather folder into rooms filled with people who believed appearance mattered more than character. Now nobody overlooked her anymore. Damien Cross's name still appeared occasionally in financial articles discussing failed expansion strategies and executive overreach, but even those stories were already fading. Men like him always believe they are unforgettable until the world quietly moves on without them. I remained near the windows a little longer after the reception ended, watching snow continue falling across Chicago, while warm light reflected softly against the frozen river below. Somewhere beneath the quiet music and distant conversations, I finally felt the company breathing the way my late husband once hoped it would. Not louder, not richer, simply wiser.